afternoon, and welcome to this yet another episode of the Dialogue of a Lawyer. And we're going to be looking at the effectiveness of the international justice mechanisms in tackling or preventing crimes against humanity in the Great Lakes region of the East African region. There is a slight background to this, and the background is that in the past few decades, there have been legal efforts to bring to justice actors that commit, aid, incite, or abet crimes against humanity. The ICC has had both individual actors and sitting heads of states who have either been indicted or prosecuted. However, there seems to be in the region ongoing issues around crimes against humanity, political violence, and general civil and violent conflict. And yet, there have been a number of international aid initiatives in the region where, for example, they've had tribunals, investigations, ICC interventions, but nevertheless, the violence appears to persist. And so the question has to be asked, are these mechanisms working? Is there another way? What is missing? And if so, what can be done to ensure that these mechanisms are put in place so that we don't have yet another cycle of such violence, which sadly, in most cases, leads to quite preventable loss of life. And so this is where we come in with this discussion. Admittedly, it's a very understandably a very wide subject, but we are trying to just sort of provide a synopsis as to what is a complex issue here. And so, to date, among the many cases the ICC probed, both against individual actors and sitting heads of states, there are some who have been either indicted or prosecuted. But despite this, as I mentioned earlier, there is still persistent conflict in the region and other areas of the world. And so, what can be done? There are glimpses of internal improvement in countries such as, for example, Kenya, where in comparison to other years such as 2007, for example, where there was unfortunately ethnic violence that led to the indictment of specific individuals, but that case was dismissed by the ICC. But in comparison to the more recent elections, such as the most concluded one in 2022, although there were skirmishes at the tallying center, the elections were largely peaceful, and the dispute was settled by the Kenya Supreme Court, which is increasingly becoming impressive. Of course, there are shortcomings. There are various, sort of expressions of dissatisfaction from the protagonists. But the Kenyan court seems to be ultimately taking control whenever there are election disputes. And in the most recent one, some of the contesting parties brought the case before it, and I think there was a unanimous decision um, in terms of the announcements made by the country's electoral commission. So this scenario leads then to a question as to whether the international justice mechanisms in the Great Lakes region thus far are an effective mechanism in preventing crimes against humanity. And it is arguable that this has neither been effective, nor has it been a deterrent in preventing crimes against humanity. Just to give an overview, there have been recent political developments around the world that have shaped international institutions and the semblance of the world order negotiated or established since its lawful application as we know it after the Second World War appears to have been shaken, if not reversed. And the political, socio-economic and regional relationships in Europe have also been reshaped by what is known as Brexit, which refers to the departure of the United Kingdom from the European Union. And furthermore, there have been other sort of wars right in the center of Europe, with some of which, one of which is ongoing. But on the African continent, among other momentous events, there was a coup d'etat in Zimbabwe which toppled the long-standing freedom fighter turned dictator Robert Mugabe. There was an insurrection in Sudan, a civil war in South Sudan as well as Ethiopia, and there was also what has been classified as the most violent election by observers and alleged apparent, according to the papers filed in the ICC and various human rights reports, there has been it was characterized as the most violent election in Uganda, and consequently the various human rights groups such as Human Rights Watch and the donor country reports themselves point out some of these allegations. And likewise, the war in Congo continues to rage between rebels or militias against the Congo government, whilst tensions mount between Congo and Rwanda, and which led to the East African heads of state, led by the outgoing now former president Uhuru Kenyatta, to have authorized sending peacekeeping forces to the country, and that is DRC Congo, former Zaire under the late Mobutu Sese Seko was a Banga. However, despite the above political violence in the region, there appears to be an emerging political and judicial maturity. Interestingly, even War-torn Congo has managed a peaceful transition of sorts, however imperfect. But there has been a transition from Lawrence Kabila to the current president. Unlike in other countries where there are long-standing leaders such as Cameroon, Uganda, and Eritrea, among others. Similarly, Ethiopia, after over 2 decades, has been mired in a war that threatens its federal statehood. However, there seems to have been some sort of peace process that appears to be holding, because we don't hear the same level of atrocities and fighting as we had a few months ago, for the most part of the last 1 or 2 years. And however, in notable contrast, the Kenyan court appears to have demonstrated and exercised a degree of independence and constitutional valor by overturning an election, along with legally rejecting a bid to amend the constitution. And this is a distinct trend compared to incumbent in some countries where long-standing leaders cling to power. Now, whether these relative islands of peaceful transfers of power and whether these relevant islands of peaceful transfer and judicial restraints in the respective countries have a nexus to the IC proceedings or to the internal institutions, it's difficult to judge at the present time, but will continue to be examined as the Kenyan judicial system stands the test of time. But what is clear is that the ICC, United Nations, and other global institutions, such as special tribunals, which have shaped international cooperation among nations, are facing multiple stress tests. And in the already volatile Great Lakes region, such a situation creates a vacuum which could aggravate or generate political violence, including crimes against humanity. Hence, the need to determine, interrogate, and examine in detail effectiveness of international justice mechanisms against crimes against humanity in the region. But it obviously, in this sort of setting and forum, it requires an in-depth analysis, perhaps with other analysts from the region. But for the purpose of this discussion, we just basically going over the initial, just as a sort of a synopsis of the sort of current situation in the country. As I mentioned, the Great Lakes has faced numerous conflicts over the last 5 decades, stretching back to the Idi Amin days of Uganda, who was dislodged by the Tanzania army with the help of Ugandan exiles. And although the ICC was not instituted by then, many lives were lost in the 1980s conflict in Uganda, the Rwanda genocide in the 90s, Somalia, Congo, Burundi, Ethiopia, Sudan, and now sadly South Sudan. And Kenya has also faced internal and external conflicts with the Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, and the region have been engaged in conflicts that have displaced thousands and cost thousands of lives. It is therefore evident that this region remains volatile, ripe for war and internal conflicts, which consequently behoves analysis, scrutiny, examination by all those who are interested in the region, who have stake in the region, who are friends of the region, who are sons and daughters of the region, to ensure that immediately this phenomenon of violent conflict stops. The cycle is stopped and is not repeated again and again in a peaceful manner. Whether that requires involvement of international law and partners, or a combination of local solutions, is something that needs to be explored and cemented properly. As you know, without that, there's little or no hope for economic development, the realization of the potential, the fruitful extraction of the human resources that not just the human resources but the natural resources that are prevalent, that exist in that part of the world, which sadly to date have not been adequately utilized as it could be for the benefit of the region as a whole and the whole world, because today we live in a globalized economy where, for example, the mining of cobalt in Congo is essential for China's production of mobile phones, which are used all over the world and are essential for almost every aspect of day-to-day existence. So there is a sense of urgency which is punctuated by recent discoveries, as mentioned, of even vast natural resources in the region, but with little or no meaningful democratic transitions in place in some of the countries in the region. And as we know from history, not just from history, but other areas such as in the Middle East, where there are potential natural resources or oil reserves, there tends to be conflict, and sadly, or sometimes conflict is almost inevitable. And furthermore, the region has a direct nexus to the stability of the entire continent, which is faced with insurgent terrorist networks in countries like Mali, North Nigeria, Chad, and others. And furthermore, the humanitarian challenges of displacing populations, hunger, and disease are inevitable where such violence erupts, as we see the humanitarian flood of refugees and population in Ukraine, Syria, and Afghanistan, and now increasingly in Iran. And we see that how sadly plays it out in the Mediterranean. And just this weekend, um, many people, scores of people lost their lives, and which was where people remains were discovered on the coast and the beaches of Italy over the weekend, which is a tragedy that is arguably potentially avoidable. But these have to appear. All these issues have to appear to have a direct impact on international security, migration, and peace. Therefore, it's really important to understand, assess, and examine the current international justice mechanisms to prevent further violent conflict and crimes against in the region. Um, the Thus far, the international justice system that has been applied in this region to date needs to be subjected to rigorous review, audit, and examination to make a contribution which could prevent further crimes against humanity in a region, as I've stated, that is already experiencing political violence with insecurity and associated with governance, among other causes. And they're really, to better understand that, there's potentially a few questions that need to be framed and responded to. And among those are, well, what are crimes against humanity in the context of international law? What are the historic causes of crimes against humanity in the region? What are the legal functions, power, jurisdiction of the special tribunals, ICC, and the UN Security Council? What is the record to date by these entities or mechanisms in preventing crimes against humanity in the region? And what is the role of politics per se, or diplomacy, as an embedded tool of prosecutors to focus on long-term peace building rather than justice? And how effective to date are the actions or steps taken by international justice institutions in preventing current and future crimes against humanity? And lastly, which is the whole point of the exercise, is what proposals for reform are suggested to prevent or mitigate the likelihood of crimes against humanity in the region. And so once those key questions are triangulated and information is brought together, then hopefully that could provide either foundation or contribution, or even viable solutions to this conundrum of the cycle of the political violence and crimes against humanity in the region. And but as things stand, it is arguable that the current international justice mechanisms are not only ineffective but are negligible in preventing crimes against humanity. And we need to really focus on this question and try to make a contribution to minimizing the causes. But as more things, this is probably an issue that will be fully answered in the distance of time. But any contribution here can assist policymakers, lawyers, the international community to determine the most effective mechanisms to prevent crimes against humanity and political violence in the region. But this contribution hopefully will secure a foundation to either existing scholarship, or in the future. But as I mentioned earlier, legal and democratic outcomes are generally best studied or looked at with the luxury and hindsight that time allows. But nevertheless, um, one has to make a start. And this is one of those discussions that we've opened up. And so that is, in a nutshell, what we can sort of look at today. And we will um, we will come back to the issue. But for now, there we shall leave it, and we'll speak again next time. Thank you, and speak to you soon. And this is from the Lead Counsel, Diary of a Lawyer. Thank you. Bye. Speak to you soon.